Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Sometimes trying to live the Christian life can leave you feeling a bit crazy. It's not exactly easy trying to live out your faith in the midst of a sin-filled world. And there are times when this life of faith leads us to do some crazy things in order to survive. Rather than trust God, we find ourselves taking matters into our own hands, and the results are always less than satisfactory. David would learn that invaluable lesson when he made the fateful decision to run from King Saul and seek refuge among the Philistines, the sworn enemies of Israel. David's strategy was not God-ordained and would end up putting him in a very precarious position. Seeking to preserve his own life by his own methods, he would end up risking death at the hands of his enemies. His solution would prove far from ideal. And it all began when he failed to trust God. The very same God who had anointed him king was fully capable of making him king. But David had his doubts. He let his outer circumstances determine his outlook on God. He saw his trials as evidence of God's absence and his own need to take matters into his own hands. But God had not left him, and God was not done with him. When reading these verses, the question that should immediately come into your mind is, what was David thinking? There seems to be nothing rational or logical in his behavior. Why in the world would David, the very man who killed Goliath, who was from Gath, choose to seek refuge in Gath, and while carrying the sword that once belonged to Goliath? What kind of flawed logic did David use to think that he would be welcomed with open arms? After all, it was David who, in an act of overachievement, killed 200 Philistines in order to obtain the 100 foreskins Saul had demanded as a dowry for his daughter Michal. It was David who had served as a commander in Saul's forces and had won great victories over the Philistines. So what would possess him to think that they would provide him with refuge? From what we know of David's faithfulness to God and his hatred of the enemies of God, it seems quite unlikely that David had gone to Gath to offer his services as a warrior to King Achish. In other words, David was not considering switching sides and fighting for the Philistines against his own people. So why did he go? The text doesn't tell us. We can only conjecture that David was desperate to get away from Saul and any troops that may be out to arrest him. He knew that the last place Saul would look for him was in the land of the Philistines. But David didn't think his strategy through all the way. He made a rash decision, under duress, and now found himself in a very dangerous spot. The Philistines immediately recognized David. It's interesting to note that they referred to David as the king of the land. They had heard about the songs sung about David that celebrated his military exploits and lauded him as greater than Saul. It's doubtful that they had heard about David's anointing, but they most likely viewed David as the true leader of the Israelites. At the incident in the valley of Elah, Goliath had challenged Saul and his men to send a champion to face him in hand-to-hand combat, but no one would step forward. Day after day he taunted them, but Saul remained in the background, afraid to take up the challenge and take on Goliath. At that moment, the Philistines most likely lost all respect for Saul as a king, and when David ended up slaying Goliath, they saw him as the true king of Israel. But whatever the case, they knew that the man standing before them was an enemy and a threat. The text rather matter-of-factly states, "And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish the king of Gath." It was as if David woke up from a bad dream and realized the gravity of his situation. The stupidity of his decision to go to Gath suddenly dawned on him, and he was much afraid. He was petrified, terrified, and mortified that he had ever come up with this doomed plan in the first place. So finding himself in a jam, David resorted to deceit. Here was the man who had killed Goliath, defeated hundreds of Philistines in battle, slaughtered 200 Philistines just to pay the dowry for his wife, and who was carrying the sword of Goliath in his hand, and yet he chose to feign madness rather than trust God and fight his enemies. David somehow forgot all about his anointing and the fact that God had been by his side during all the conflicts of his life. The young man who once shouted, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine, and then took the life of Goliath with nothing more than a sling and a stone, was now so fearful in the face of his enemies that he resorted to acting like a madman. The Message paraphrases verse 13 this way: "So right there, while they were looking at him, he pretended to go crazy, pounding his head on the city gate and foaming at the mouth, spit dripping from his beard." What a scene! What a sad situation for the future king of Israel to find himself in. This is the same David who would later write, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He is my steadfast love and my fortress, my stronghold and my deliverer, my shield and he in whom I take refuge, who subdues peoples under me." Psalm 144, verses 1 through 2. He also wrote, "He trains my hands for war, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze." Psalm 18, verse 34. This ill-timed, poorly conceived plan of David would be used by God to teach his young king-in-waiting an invaluable lesson about faith. David would learn to place his trust in God rather than his own rash plans and flawed attempts at self-preservation. David would escape with his life, if not his dignity, but he would not forget that day. In fact, he ended up penning the words of Psalm 34 as a result of this encounter with King Achish. "I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears." Psalm 34, verse 4. "In my desperation I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles." Psalm 34, verse 6. The Lord hears his people when they call to him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. Psalm 34, verse 17. The righteous person faces many troubles, but the Lord comes to the rescue each time. For the Lord protects the bones of the righteous. Not one of them is broken. Psalm 34, verses 19 through 20. It's interesting to read these statements in light of what actually happened that day. There's no indication that God intervened. David didn't take the sword of Goliath and slaughter King Achish and all his soldiers. There was no lightning bolt from heaven that struck down the Philistines and allowed David to walk away safe and secure. There's no mention of any miraculous intervention on God's part. What really happened is that David resorted to acting like a madman, complete with drool dripping from his beard. Faced with the prospect of death, David had taken matters into his own hands and escaped with his life because he was willing to throw away any sense of pride or dignity he had. And yet, when looking back on that day, David saw his rescue as having come from God. In spite of his actions, God had rescued him. While he had run from the land of God to the land of the enemies of God, God had remained with him. Even at one of his worst moments, God had not abandoned him. Regardless of how badly David's poor attempt at self-preservation had turned out, God was the one who rescued David from himself. And that is what God does for his own. God had said David would be the next king of Israel, and he would be. Even David, at his worst moment, couldn't screw up God's plan. He could make things harder on himself, but nothing he did would make it too hard for God to fulfill his divine plan for him. Even our bouts of temporary insanity cannot prevent the future fulfillment of God's plans for us.